I just want to welcome everybody to our second round of our Cattle Conversations series. And today, Thursday, April 8th, this is a kind of a collaboration with K-State Research and Extension. We have multiple districts participating in this, and we certainly want to thank everybody for coming in today, and I want to thank the team of agents and that we've worked together to kind of bring you this series on really this series in April is kind of focused around some range management type things. And so just kind of stick with me here for a little bit as we cover some house cleaning items and just want to recognize kind of those people behind the scenes. There we go. So realistically, as I said, this is kind of a team effort that includes many of us across the central part of the state of Kansas. We've got multiple people and want to recognize them. Justine Henderson is the livestock agent with the Central Kansas District. Alicia Bohr is the ag agent, the generalist for Cottonwood District. And then you've got me that you're listening to right now. I'm Clint Laughlin, the livestock agent for the Midway Extension District. Brett Melton is the livestock agent for the River Valley District. And Sandra Wick is another one of our very important team members here. She is also the crop agent for the Post Rock District, but for a prolonged period of time has also been serving Post Rock producers as the livestock agent as well. So we certainly want to say thank you to the team to put this together. We couldn't do it by ourselves, and so really, if you have any other questions or anything on feedback of this series or anything on the speaker today, feel free to reach out to us and in any of our districts and ask those questions. Okay, so realistically, I know we've got a great speaker today, and for those of you that are still getting used to using Zoom, if you want to ask a question, we will get our questions answered at the end of the presentation today by Dr. Harmoney. So really just use the chat box, and it's located at the bottom of your screen, and type that into that chat box, and we'll make sure that question gets asked to our speaker today. And if for some reason that doesn't work, feel free to email your questions to Sandra or anyone else on the team. I know Keith has a couple poll questions for our attendees today. So during the presentation, Keith will be asking some of those questions, and you guys will have the chance to answer those. Simply click on your desired response on the screen, and after we close that poll question, those results from what everybody thought and answered will be displayed. Okay. At this time, just would like to recognize again our speaker, Dr. Keith Harmoney. Keith is really very involved with the range research program at the Hayes Research Center, and focuses a lot of his research on mid and short grass prairie that's kind of located in the western 2/3 of Kansas, sorry, not campus, which encompasses about 12 million acres. The goal is to develop economically viable forage-based beef production systems for both cow-calf and stocker operations. And I've enjoyed working with Keith on a couple different projects, and is very knowledgeable in all things range. So we certainly want to welcome him today and say thank you for spending time with us today. So Keith, I'll stop sharing my screen right now, and so you can kind of jump in and start sharing yours.
Oh, you're wanting me to share mine. Okay. I guess I thought you were going to be sharing your screen with
I've
my
got it here too.
I can pull it up.
That's all right. I got it right here.
You just asked for my presentation, so there was a backup. Is that what that was for?
Let me see here.
I have mine pulled up. I can share it.
Okay. Can you see that all right?
I can see it from here just fine.
Okay.
All right. Well, everyone, thanks for joining us. And I am going to be talking today about a couple undesirables that we have in our pastures in western Kansas, and actually a lot of these can also be found in eastern Kansas. But I'm going to be talking today about thistles and old world bluestems. And so you can click onto the next screen here. And one of the most important things to consider when talking about thistles is knowing what thistle you have. So one of the most important points is thistle ID. And so I'm going to start off today. We're going to have a little bit of thistle ID quiz going on here. So if you want to move on to the next slide, we'll start with the first thistle. And this very first one is a thistle that's not real common in Kansas, but it can be found in certain locations. And those areas where it is found, it forms really dense, thick stands, and it's very growthy and can produce very large plants. And they can become so thick that animals won't walk through the stands of them. I've only seen a few of these plants in person in western Kansas, so I know there are some around, but I have yet to see a really thick, dense patch of it. The rosettes kind of have a gray, green, blue appearance to them because they have some cottony hairs on the surface to give them that look. And the mature plant, it looks like it has wings on the stem because the leaf material follows the stem. And so it has a winged appearance to it. So if anybody has an idea what this is, they could type it into the chat. Have any idea what it is right now, go ahead and type it in. I gave you 8 options there at the top, and these are the 8 thistles that we're going to be talking about having our little ID quiz on. I don't see anybody typing it in yet. Oh, there's a guess, bull thistle. That's a decent guess. That's not quite the correct one. But this one is called Scotch Thistle. And that winged portion of the leaf that travels down the stem, so it looks like the stem has leaf material growing all over on it, is one of the main characteristics to distinguish it. So you can go on to the next one. Next slide. And notice up there at the top, I've got Scotch Thistle crossed out. So we're going to go by process of elimination here on the next ones. So you have one fewer to choose from. This one is not a true thistle, but it's thistle-like, and it's found more in eastern Kansas. It can grow really tall, 8 to 9 feet tall, and the plant's very narrow. And it also has an egg-shaped head on it. And under that egg-shaped head, it has really long sepals that form a cup that the head sits on. And it is it's really striking in appearance. The plant, when it first starts to grow, it actually doesn't have very long spines on it, if any spines are found at all. But it has a really thistle-like appearance to it. And this one is common or cutleaf thistle, common or cutleaf teasel, depending on if the leaves have lobes on them or not. The picture to the right is cutleaf teasel, where the leaves have lobes to them. Common teasel doesn't have those lobes. The leaves are all entire. But this one is more commonly found in eastern Kansas. I just wasn't sure if we were going to have some folks from eastern Kansas join us on this Zoom or not. You can go on to the next one. Next slide. This is a thistle that's actually a native thistle to Kansas, but it is a biennial. So it produces a rosette in one season, and then it'll bolt the next season. It has a dark green leaf when it's young, has a dark green upper surface, but when you flip the leaf over, and you can kind of see in the picture on the right, one of those leaves has twisted, and so you can see the underneath side, and the underneath side is white, and it's cottony looking. And those lower leaves have really deep lobes in them. Now, if you look at the picture on the left and you look at the upper leaves, the leaves are a lot smaller and the leaves are entire. And they don't have those lobes with as many points on them as the lower leaves. And as I said, this one is a native and it is a biennial. So did I see someone take a guess as to what that one was? A guess for Canada thistle. Canada thistles are perennials, so this one is not Canada thistle. It's a good guess though. Another thing that you see on this thistle that's a little bit unique is the round globe portion of the flower. The lower portion of the head is a cylindrical globe. And this one would be tall thistle. It's not quite as common as other thistles in Kansas, but it can be a problem in some locations because it is a biennial and it does reproduce by seed. Even though it is a native, it can form colonies. That can be a problem at times. But out of our biennial thistles, this is probably the one that is probably the least invasive out of all the biennials. So you can go on to the next slide. All right, so we've seen tall thistle and teasel and Scotch thistle. The thistle on your screen now is probably our most common problem biennial thistle, and its main characteristics is that the plant is mostly all glabrous, which means it doesn't have any hair on it, and it also has a really wide and prominent white midvein on both the young leaves and the older leaves. And it doesn't have a globe head like many thistles do. It's more of a flat head. This is the one that you probably see most often out in pastures as you drive by somewhere that's been infested. And I see a guess there for musk thistle and a couple guesses, and that is correct. That is musk thistle. And it is a biennial, so it too forms a rosette during the first growing season when it germinates, or in the fall when it germinates, and it will bolt and produce a head the next season. So we can go ahead and go to the next one. To me, this is our second most common thistle that we have out in western Kansas. That's a problem thistle. It has a dark green leaf to it, and it has a very cottony surface on it, which can give it a gray appearance at some time. It is probably one of our most branched thistles, and when it bolts and forms those branches, it probably has the most diverse set of heads and blooms on it of any of our thistles. We can get blooms anywhere from buds just starting to form a head, all the way to heads that have already produced mature seed and start dropping seed. So you can find heads in all stages on this plant. And it will flower later than a lot of our other thistles, and it will flower longer into the season than some of our other thistles. And I see someone there is saying that it's bull thistle, and that is correct. Can you go to the next slide, Clinton? And that bull thistle has a pretty unique leaf shape to it, in that it's really deeply lobed, and that it had really deep lobing on it. And also the amount of leaf material there is got a very thin margin from the outer part of the leaf to where the mid vein is. And so it's really characteristic in that way, and that the leaf portion is really has a thin or narrow area between the edge and the mid vein. All right, go ahead to the next one, Clint. This to me is one of our most problematic thistles, or one of the hardest ones to try to control. And that's because it's a perennial with root stalks that are able to grow underneath the soil surface and are able to grow several inches in a growing season, inches to feet, and will produce a new plant. And this plant also is able to reproduce by seed. So not only can you get new young plants starting from seed each year, you can also get plants starting from root stalks each year. And this is also one of probably the most branched thistles that we have, with the smallest heads. Each one of those heads on this plant is only about a dime in size, but it can still produce a lot of seed. Go on to the next slide, Clinton. And this is a good picture of the rootstock under the soil surface and why it's so difficult to control. You can remove the top portion of the plant through fire or through mowing or some method like that, but there's still perennial parts to that plant underneath the soil surface that are going to grow and can expand in size. And so this plant can form really large, dense, and thick colonies over the course of time. And I see in the chat that someone guessed that it was Canada thistle, and that is correct. It is Canada thistle. So, all right, go on to our next slide. So we have two thistles left. We have wavy leaf thistle and yellow spine thistle. And the one pictured here is a plant that has hair on both the upper leaf surface and on the lower leaf surface. And those white hairs give it a real grayish appearance. And the leaves really undulate. The lobes on it are really undulating or wavy. And that really is an indicator of what its name is. It is a perennial, and it forms a taproot. And so it's longer lived than most of our other thistles. Even though it's longer lived, it doesn't spread like many of our other thistles. These plants tend to be more solitary and don't really form thick colonies at all. And this one is wavy leaf thistle. That undulating leaf really is why it gets its name. It really is a true characteristic, that wavy or undulating leaf. So go on to the next one, Clinton. And so this one looks a lot like wavy leaf, except the lobes on the leaves are more compact or tight together, and they have longer spines where each one of those lobes ends. And it also has hair on the upper surface and lower leaf surface. And so it too has a grayish look to it. So it's really easy to confuse with the prior thistle, wavy leaf. go on to the next slide, Clint. And this is a good picture of a wavy leaf thistle head on the left and a yellow spine thistle head on the right. And notice the longer yellow spines on the head of the yellow spine on the right side. That is one of the main ways to be able to tell wavy leaf thistle and yellow spine thistle apart, is to be able to have the heads of those two together to compare the length of the spines. The spines on those yellow spine thistles are much, much longer, both on the head and also on the leaf. So go ahead and go to the next slide, Clint. And this could be a good time to put up the first poll that was created after everyone was able to see all those different thistles to ID them. You could go ahead and type in what your most problematic thistles are that you have on your property that you either own or manage that you're wanting to try to control. So if you would fill in that poll, and we'll get the results back in a little bit. So some of the control options that we have. Well, what you do for control is really going to depend on what the species present are. With some of the species, you may not want to do anything, especially with the wavy leaf and yellow spine thistles. Those are perennial thistles that don't really spread quickly at all. They're longer lived from tap roots and don't have a root stock, lateral root stock that will increase the plant to the plant colony to the side. So they are much less of a problem. And if you do find an area where you do have a colony of them that is thicker than what you would desire, they can be treated with a herbicide. And one of the things that really needs to be included with any herbicide that's applied to them is a surfactant, because they have such dense and thick hair on the leaf surface. Those thistles need that surfactant for that plant to be able to uptake that herbicide. Now, we also have prescribed burning as an option that can help reduce the population of some of these, especially the biennials, the invasive biennials. Burning may help to reduce the amount of viable seed that's present that would be able to germinate and grow into a plant later on. Burning may also be able to reduce the presence of rosettes, depending on how far under the soil surface the growing point is. With some of these biennials and some of these rosettes, the growing point may be under the soil surface far enough that a fire won't damage them, and so you may burn and those thistles are still able to grow and become a mature plant. So burning may not eliminate them, but it could help in reducing the seed load, and also depending on if that growing point is close enough to the soil surface, may cause some damage. Another option that we have is mowing for some of these invasive biennials. After they've bolted and started to form heads, mowing them will reduce that head and that growing point, and really can reduce seed production. Tall thistle is probably the one that would work best on, because it will tend to form a new stem or rebolt less than the other biennials that are in this group. Musk thistle, bull thistle, Scotch thistle, teasel, those all would probably require multiple mowings, because there is a possibility that they could form a new stem and bolt and form heads again later. Those plants are going to be much less growthy and are going to be weaker plants, but they still might be able to produce a viable seed head. Now, along with mowing, I don't have this included in here, but there are some folks that have trained their livestock to graze on thistles. And that would basically be doing the same thing as mowing. If you have some animals that you were able to train to prescribe graze on thistles, you know, just like with mowing, would take repeated grazing to be able to reduce that population down. And especially with the case of Canada thistle, because it has root stalks under the soil surface and it's a perennial, it would more than likely be a longer term method of trying to control it by grazing it rather than using some other method like a herbicide. But grazing is an option that would be kind of like mowing if you had animals that were trained. And then for the last option I have on here, have herbicide application. For Canada thistle, as I just mentioned, some folks have trained animals to graze on it, but that is not going to completely control it or get rid of it. Because it is a perennial with those root stalks, it's more than likely going to take a herbicide to be able to control that. So for these perennials and biennials, any herbicide that you use, you're going to want to use a surfactant in order to help that herbicide spread out on the leaf and for better uptake. It's almost like putting inoculant on legumes when you seed them. It's a insurance policy. Having that surfactant in the herbicide is kind of like a insurance policy to help that herbicide get uptake into the plant. For these biennials, it's they're easiest to control in the fall when those plants are rosettes. They're small. If there's a window in November, October, when there's a warm spell and those plants are actively growing, those little rosettes, they have a lot of sunshine and warmth for them to be able to grow. That's a great time for that herbicide to be applied so that plant can uptake it and get it down into its growing point and effectively kill it before it becomes a problem. They're easiest to control while they're rosettes. And for Canada thistle, it's best to apply it in the fall when those plants are uptaking or producing carbohydrate and putting them into its storage areas under the soil surface in the ground. So the fall is the best time, as well as early spring before flowers are produced. So if you're wanting to try to control these thistles, it's best to do it either in the late fall or the early spring. Go on to the next slide, Clint. So this is a picture of a rosette and the musk thistle rosette, and this is when they're going to be most susceptible before they start to bolt. When they start to bolt, they have so much nutrient flow and carbohydrate allocation to the upper portion of the plant that they're much harder to control than when they're young. So go on to the next slide. And this is a good example of thistles that have taken over an area, and they've actually proceeded through their life cycle enough that they've started to put out full blooms, and any herbicide application done to a stand like this at this time probably is not going to work quickly enough to prevent any seed from going to maturity and being dropped. So in an instance like this, one of the options that you would maybe first want to try would be mowing, and to get rid of those seed heads, cut them off, get them cut off from the plant so there's no more water supply or nutrient supply to them for those flowers to form mature seed. So thick stands like this, mowing may be an option, and of course it may take repeated mowing. but that's going to be one of the quickest ways to reduce the seed load, would be to get the tops off of those plants and cut them off from the nutrient and water supply. So go on to the next slide. And this is the Canada thistle, and this is a little colony of it. And you can see how those underground root stalks allow that plant to really form a dense, thick mat on the soil surface, and they can really shade out grass and prevent other desired forage from growing in the area. And so this to me is one of the most problematic thistles we have. This is one that you really don't want started on any property that you would manage or own.
Hey, Keith, before you go on, and there's a question here that might pertain to what you're talking about right now.
Okay.
Are there grazing management practices that would help control these thistles as well? Or, you know, some sort of grazing management that has been more successful with controlling some of these, for example, like rotational versus set stock or continuous grazing?
Well, as far as grazing practices are concerned, any grazing method, rotational or set stalking, can be equally as effective at trying to prevent thistles from getting started, or by competing with the thistles, basically by just the vigor of the grass and the vegetation that's growing. The more vigorous and healthy a plant population is, or a grass stand is, the more it's going to compete with the thistles and any young seedlings that would try to get started. And you can have a healthy grass stand with set stock or rotational stalking. It doesn't really matter. You can have a equally competitive grass stand with either one of those methods. It all depends on how you manage each one of those. You know, if you have a set stock pasture that is overutilized, you open yourself up to having less competition for invading plants. And that's the same way with rotational stocking. If you have a rotational system, but you overstock it, overutilize, you're going to weaken your overall pasture vigor, and it's not going to be able to compete as well with thistles.
Okay.
But competition is one of the main things that can help prevent or reduce the thistle load.
Okay, and we have one more question before we leave thistles. When do the seeds of the thistles become viable after they flower, and when would mowing be useless to do that?
That's a really good question, and I don't know the exact time length that it takes for those to become viable. I would say that within, well, this is just an educated estimate or educated guesstimate. I would say that it probably takes probably maybe a week after you first see that bloom open up, where that seed has probably been pollinated and has started to form a viable seed.
Okay.
But I don't know the exact number of days, and it may depend on which species you're talking about as well. Each one of those species may be different in their length of time.
Okay. So real quickly here, when would mowing be not good to use then, or where it wouldn't be effective?
If you've already seen some of those heads start to release the seed, then it's probably, then of course it's too late. Mowing, you would basically be helping disperse those seeds.
Right. Okay, thanks.
All right, go on to the next slide. Here we go. This is a picture of a pasture I was in where there were brush or tree species and musk thistle all in the same pasture. And mid-May to the 1st of June is probably a good time for being able to get control of both brush species and musk thistle or other thistles in the same application. What you see in this picture here is actually honey locust, and honey locust, buckbrush, many other brush species. By middle May to the end of May, they've almost have been able to fully develop their leaves. And at that time, musk thistle and other thistles may not have produced blooming heads yet. And so it may be a good time for being able to get the most bang for your buck if you have all those problem species in a pasture, to be able to control them with one application. This picture here was actually a picture that was taken, I believe, about June 16th. And so by that time, a lot of these thistles here have bloomed, and some of them have already started to produce some mature seeds. So it's a little bit late for this pasture. But if it was done 2 weeks earlier, 2 to 3 weeks earlier, they would have been able to do a pretty good job on getting rid of both the honey locust and the thistles. So we can go on to the next slide. So what are some of the herbicides for thistle control? The herbicides that are listed here, that are listed by themselves, that aren't in mixes: aminopyrrolid, metsulfuron methyl, dicamba, picloram. Those are all very effective on thistles when they're young rosettes, that they can usually be used by themselves, and usually at the mid to lower rates. Rosettes are very susceptible to those herbicides when they're young. And that would be applied both in the fall or the early spring. Now, if we're applying these herbicides to thistles after they've started to bolt, then that's the time where we would probably get more bang from our buck from including some other herbicide in with them, so that we have a mixture. So adding 2,4-D or adding metsulfuron methyl to these herbicides, so that you at least have a 2-chemical combination, that's usually going to help with the control, and also the speed of control, or reduce the amount of time it takes for them to start showing stress and actually succumbing to the herbicide. So usually these mixtures are going to be better for applying the herbicide later in the growth cycle, when those plants have started bolting already. And that would also be the case for using the higher rates as well. Higher rates plus adding another herbicide to the mix. So any questions on that? If not, I guess we could go on to the next slide. This is essentially what we want to see after we applied our herbicide. We want to see those plants that they're curling up, they're drying up, they're desiccating, and we don't want to see plants that have started to droop heads and then have those heads make an S curve and shoot back up towards the sky again, showing that they're still viable. If you see that happening, it means that your herbicide or your application wasn't as effective as what it could have been, and those plants still may be producing some viable seed. If you see them start to nod and then curve back up to the sky again, those plants are probably still viable. So anyway, we'll move on to the next invasive species that I wanted to talk about today, and that is oral bluestem. And just like ID is important for thistles, ID is also important for looking at the different bluestem species we have in the state. We have two introduced old world bluestem species that are found here. And those are yellow bluestem in the center and Caucasian bluestem on the bottom right. Those two were both introduced from Africa or Asia, and Caucasian bluestem is also found in Australia, and they're both adapted to arid, dry climates. So they're very well adapted to Kansas and the southern Great Plains, and they also respond very well to moisture and nutrient supply. So they can be productive both in dry conditions that are infertile, but they can also be very prolific in areas that have abundant rainfall and are very fertile. And they basically can form monocultures. And the yellow bluestem can look a lot like the seed head of a big bluestem on the right. And at times it can also look a lot like silver bluestem, which is on the bottom left. The hairy seed heads and that turkey foot shape is sometimes hard to tell these plants apart. And the same way for Caucasian bluestem, it's got a branched seed head, and silver bluestem oftentimes shows that branched look to it as well. And so they're sometimes hard to distinguish apart. So go on to the next slide. One way that for folks that have seen a lot of these old world bluestems growing, one way that they're able to tell what they look like in a pasture in the spring, to be able to identify them from native grasses, is they have a really more pale, light green or yellowish color to the leaf material. And so in this picture here, you can see one large clump of old world bluestem right in the middle, and another smaller clump of it just to the lower right. And that pale green color is a really good indicator of where you might have old world bluestem plants out in a pasture in the springtime. We'll go on to the next one. And these old world bluestems, they will start to mature and elongate and form stems and seed heads before our native grasses do. And so they will form these purple colored seed heads before our native grasses. And so another good time of the year to be able to pick these out is before our native grasses start to push out their seed heads. And you can see this purple colored haze out in a pasture, or this colored patchiness out in a pasture. And that could be an indicator where you have some old world bluestem. But that purple colored patchiness when the seed heads start to pop out is another good indicator. And so if you find this out in your pasture, you may want to, if you're not able to identify it yourself, you may want to have somebody come and look at it to see if you do have these old world bluestems. You can go on to the next one. And because they drop their seed before our native grasses do and reach maturity before our native grasses, they will also start to dry up and bleach out before our native grasses. What you see here is a patch of old world bluestem that the stem has started to turn bleach white in the fall before our native grasses have. And so those three time periods, the yellowish pale green in the springtime, the purplish seed head popping out before other grasses, and this really white bleached out patchiness that you see in the fall, those are all three really good indicators of where old world bluestem patches might be out in the pasture. So if you see any of that, you may want to have somebody look and identify those patches to see exactly what those grasses are out in the pasture. So right now might be a pretty good time to do the second poll about old world bluestem. with the very first poll, it was pretty evident that by far the most problematic thistle that folks had was musk thistle. And there were a few bull thistles and other thistles that were found on places, but by and large, musk thistle was the most prominent problem thistle. So I wanted to see if folks have any oral bluestems on the property as well. So if you're able to fill out that poll, that would be great. You can go on to the next slide. Now these oral bluestems are problematic because they will essentially take over areas and form monocultures out in pastures. And these monocultures have less wildlife diversity, insect diversity, and other native plant diversity within them. And because of that, they're really a threat to the whole grass biome and ecosystem. And these patches of oral bluestem can spread rather quickly. We have an area here on our Hayes Research Center where we followed a couple different patches of oral bluestem over the course of time, over the course of 8 and 9 years. And with this first picture here, the orange area was the size of an oral bluestem patch in 2003. And the green area is how far that patch had grown by 2011 when we mapped it again. And in comparing those two sizes of patches, it was a 13% compounded annual growth rate. That patch had grown 2.5 times the original size in 8 years. So if you go on to the next slide, Clint. And the second patch we looked at, it was a smaller patch, but this patch had increased in size by almost 3.5 times its original size, which was a 15% compounded annual growth rate. So over the course of time, these patches could grow from just a few hundred square feet up to encompassing acres of a pasture in 25 to 50 years. So they can quickly spread throughout a pasture and increase their patch size. And because they mature more quickly than other native grasses, once they reach that mature stage, they tend to be avoided and not grazed. So more pressure gets put on native grasses around these patches. So not only do they form monocultures that wildlife use less, but they also can essentially cause animals to put more pressure, grazing pressure, on native grasses around these patches. So go on to the next slide. So if you could you pop up the results of that poll again real quickly? It disappeared from my screen. Is there a way to get that to pop up again? Okay, so out of the folks on this call, 60%, over half of the folks here have oral bluestem on their property. Okay, it is found in basically every county, or has been identified in every county in Kansas. There was, except for one, there was only one county out in the very western part of the state where I don't think it's been positively identified yet. I imagine it's there, but just hasn't been identified or found. So 60% of our folks on this call have oral bluestem. That's very interesting. That tells me it's becoming more and more prominent. Okay, so what are some control options that we have for oral bluestems? Well, that depends on the level of infestation that you have. If you just have isolated plants, and it looked like most of the folks on that poll said they had fewer than 25 acres, which is good. We want to try to keep these oral bluestems down to as low of a population as possible. But if you have isolated plants that you're able to dig up by the root system, that is the best way to control those. Now, of course, that's not going to be feasible if you have a large patch or large acreage of them. But if you have individual plants that you're able to identify and know that those are over a bluestem, the best way to get rid of them is to dig them up and to basically remove them from the property. Or if you don't have a shovel and you always carry around a spray jug with you, you can have a mixture of glyphosate with you at a 2 to 3% solution and individually treat those plants. And that should be able to be a strong enough solution to be able to kill or control those plants. If you have small patches, the best options that you have are to spot spray imazapyr at 1/4 pound per acre at a 5-leaf stage, and then treat again 8 weeks later. Or you could spot spray imazapyr at a 1/2 pound per acre rate before heading. You could also spray that glyphosate mixture while those plants are actively growing. Glyphosate, though, on a patch will also basically kill or control anything else that's found in that patch. It can be very damaging to any desirable vegetation that would get sprayed with glyphosate. Most of our native desirable grasses, like big bluestem, Indian grass, little bluestem, side oats, grama, those grasses are actually tolerable to imazapyr treatments at a 1/2 pound per acre rate. So imazapyr is more of a selective herbicide for the overall bluestem compared to the glyphosate. It is not, it may not be quite as consistent in control, but if you have mixed vegetation, that imazapyr is going to be much more selective for the overall bluestem versus native species. So if you have large patches of the overall bluestem, you could spray those large areas with the imazapyr treatments above for 3 years and then overseed. Small patches, that I say small patches, when I'm talking about small patches, I'm talking about maybe the size of a vehicle. Patches that are that size are probably going to be able to naturally revegetate on their own from seed from plants that are right next to those patches. If you have larger patches, it's going to be harder for that seed to get in those large patches to get started. And there's also going to be seed from the overall bluestem in the soil seed bank. And so in these large patches, once you start treating the overall bluestem, it's going to be a longer term commitment. And there's going to be seedlings that are probably going to be able to pop up from the seed bank that can become new overall bluestem plants. And so in these large patches, they're going to probably have to be monitored and be sprayed for possibly new seedlings of overall bluestem for 3 years' time. At least we've been able to track seedlings of overall bluestem in patches coming up for 3 years after the first treatment. Another thing that you could do would be to consider managing these large patches, taking the whole pasture and managing as a monoculture, which in number 4, if the area's been untilled over time, just consider managing that pasture as an overall bluestem pasture and limit the seed production that is that's formed on that pasture by managing it intensively over time. And then making sure that anything that's done to that pasture, if hay is ever harvested from it, that hay is not transported away to another location where seed heads could possibly start a new colony. Or if it's a previously tilled area, that area could be distilled again and treated with glyphosate and then seeded to an alternative crop for 3 years' time before reseeding back to a pasture grass. So those are a few options. You want to go on to the next slide? So I was working with a producer in Ellsworth County that was very interested in increasing the wildlife habitat in one of his pastures. He had old world bluestem in it and knew he had a lot of that old world bluestem and was really concerned about what that old world bluestem was doing to his grassland bird populations. And so he started a program where he was going to control that old world bluestem and try to make it more suitable for these grassland birds and grassland bird habitat. So in 2016, there were transects that were formed in this pasture. And when evaluating those transects, 51.1% of the pasture cover along those transects was old world bluestem. So more than half of this pasture was old world bluestem, and less than half of it was native or other desirable vegetation. So it was becoming a near solid stand or monoculture of old world bluestem in some areas of this pasture. So he started a 3-year program where he was treating the pasture each year with a half a pound of imazapyr per acre each season. And so by the end of the 3rd year of treatment in 2019, after those 3 years of imazapyr application, the old world bluestem had dropped down to less than 1% cover. And in looking at the numbers there, Indian grass, big bluestem, little bluestem, over that course of time, the cover of those species, they started to increase. It wasn't a significant increase, but they started to increase because of that old world bluestem competition was basically being reduced. So the old world bluestem declined, and these native grasses, they were able to tolerate that 3 years of application, and were actually starting to form more cover in the pasture. And in 2020, that pasture was overseeded. And you could see here in 2020, in that column, with the combination of those native grasses surviving and that pasture being overseeded with native grasses, that the desirable grass cover significantly increased from 2019 to 2020. They had a very successful native grass establishment. So anyway, the old world bluestem was much reduced, and those native grasses started again becoming more prominent and dominant in the pasture. You'll notice there, though, that in 2020, without having that imazapyr application, that there was still old world bluestem in the pasture, and that it was able to rebound and recover those plants that did survive. And it got up to just over 5% cover along those transects. So even though they had a significant reduction, it didn't completely eradicate that old world bluestem, and they're still going to have to keep going out into this pasture and treating some areas, spot treating for the old world bluestem over time. So next slide, please. And this is just some pictures of that seeding that took place. There on the left, that was an area of the pasture that basically was solid old world bluestem at one time. And because of that imazapyr treatment and the loss of all that vegetation, it was such a large area, and it occurred so quickly, there wasn't enough time for any native or desirable species to really go in and take that area over. So it was left pretty bare. And so that's why this overseeding may need to be needed in these large patch areas. But went from that seedling stage, and the next couple pictures just show that same area and those native grasses growing and developing over time with adequate precipitation that fell. And by the end of the year, that picture on the right, those grasses had good enough establishment and had enough growth that year that some of those plants were almost ready to put seed heads out in that very first growing season, which is excellent establishment in 1 year's time. Very productive and successful establishment. So if you are going to treat Old World Bluestem in a pasture, just know that it is a multi-year commitment because of the seed bank of that Old World Bluestem and potential for those new Old World Bluestem seedlings to emerge and come up. I think we have a couple questions in the chat, don't we?
Yes, we do, Keith. And I know we're kind of running long on time, but we have we'll be answering these real quickly. Is the broom sedge an Old World Bluestem?
Broom sedge is not an Old World Bluestem. It is native to the Great Plains. It's not a desirable bluestem, but it is a native bluestem.
Okay, and with one other question is, do you consider the two Old World Bluestems a noxious weed, or do we need to consider it as a noxious weed?
Well, I believe noxious is basically a designation that's placed upon plants by law, and
yes,
it is not a noxious weed. It is actually so prevalent in Kansas. I don't know that we would put it under the noxious category because it is found throughout all of Kansas. I think it would be a really difficult job to get it put on the noxious weed list. But I would definitely call it invasive. Maybe not noxious, but I would definitely call it invasive. And I would do whatever I could to try to reduce the population in a pasture, or at least to try to prevent its spread into new areas.
okay. One other question that we had, would unrolling or feeding some type of a native grass hay on maybe those areas where you have that, would it actually smother it out or help encourage other natives to come back?
Well, rolling something out on those areas could smother it. However, once that litter or vegetation weathers and decays over time, excuse me, sorry, you still have the seed bank to deal with, where you still could get emergence of Old World Bluestem seedlings coming up in those areas. And it's been shown that these Old World Bluestem seedlings are able to germinate and start establishing in conditions that are dry, under more dry conditions than most of our native grasses are actually. And so you may help reduce the mature plants that are there, but you still would probably have to deal with new seedlings that would be coming up.
Okay. And I know that some of you may have more questions, but we're kind of running a little long on time. So certainly if you have more questions, get them to any of your extension agents and we can get them to Keith and get those questions answered for you. So I'm going to turn it back over to Clint.
Okay, hi everybody. Thanks again, Keith, for tuning in today and basically sharing your thoughts and expertise. Let's see. Okay, and again, thanks everybody for tuning in. We do have an evaluation that we'll ask you guys to fill out that tuned in today. And for those of you that want to tune in for our next series, it will be next week, April 15th at the same time. The speaker next week will be featuring Dr. AJ Tarpoff, our beef specialist for KSU Extension, and he will be troubleshooting pasture lameness in cattle. So again, thanks everybody for tuning in today, and let any of our staff know if you have any follow-up questions, and we'll get them to Keith.
And the evaluation for the today's presentation is in the chat box. So if you could click on that and fill out the evaluations quickly, we would certainly appreciate that.
Thanks again, everybody.